Good morning. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm DiSalvo. I'm a professor at City College in New York City. It's also a real delight to come up on the stage after Mayor Myrick, since I spent some of my formative years in Ithaca, New York. So, in fact, I cringe to learn some of those years were before he was born. My topic is basically about a book I recently wrote called Government Against Itself, which takes up the hot-button issue of public employee unions in state and local government, which has been at the center of our national politics since the recession, since the historic downturn or collapse in revenue that all of you or many of you experienced in crafting your budgets from late 2007 all the way through 2012. And in some sense, it's obviously going to be part of our presidential campaign. It's the signature issue of Governor Walker. So in that sense, he would be the first presidential candidate potentially since Calvin Coolidge to have made his name battling public employee unions. And clearly it's an issue here in New York State with Governor Cuomo and his ongoing struggles with the teachers' unions. So I submit that this has been absolutely central to American national politics over the last 5 years, and I would submit that there's lots of reasons, I'll try to spell out why it's going to be central to our politics going forward. So in some ways, I got into this subject because I came from a union family. My father was in the Carpenters Union. My grandfather was an immigrant from Sicily. It's good to share the stage with another fellow Paisan. And he worked in the steel mills in Pittsburgh. And I'm, of course, a CUNY professor, which also means you're part of it's a union agency shop, so you're part of a union there too. And I found this different. I'd worked to get a PhD, a relative degree of affluence, middle-class status as a professor, but we're still in a union, and it seemed to be quite a different enterprise than the unions that I experienced as a kid with my father and grandfather. And this just gives you a sense of sort of what I want to lay out is this different world, because we think about public employee unions. Many of you have firsthand experience negotiating contracts. But when I go around the country and talk about this issue, there's an enormous amount of conflation of public and private sector unions as organized labor as one thing. And I think that's been an analytic mistake that scholars have made, journalists have made, and much of the public doesn't see this difference. So if we're thinking about employment in America, we're really thinking about, and what I want to focus on is employment in state and local government, which is about 1/5 of the labor market. So that's an important point to remember that, 4/5 of people are working in the private sector in some capacity. So I just want to focus on this area that's familiar to all of you. And many of you in your town, in your cities and villages will be familiar to this distribution, which is where are people working when they're working in state and local government? Which is to say the vast majority of employees in state and local government are in elementary and secondary school, in the public schools, followed by higher education, public university professors like myself, protective service, police, fire, and then on down. So that gives you a rough distribution of what that 1/5 of the labor market looks like. Now, if we then try to put organized labor over that labor market and see what that looks like, here we see a big trend that's gotten a lot of attention, which is private sector labor has been on a sharp and steady decline since the 1970s in terms of overall membership, whereas public employee unions have been on an increase, as public workers belonging to unions has grown pretty steadily since the 1970s. So, such that by 2009, right at the start of the recession, a majority of all union members in the United States were public employees of one kind or another. So a dramatic transformation of the American labor movement. And so this is one of the first big points that I'd like to make, is to try to lay out why we need to think about public employee unions as separate or different from private sector unions. And the first has to do with history. They've followed really different historical trajectories. As you can You can see here one has been on a sharp decline, the other's been on a relatively rough and steady increase since the 1970s. And you can see that, I think, even better reflected here, which if you look at the blue line, that's really private sector union membership since 1973, and the yellow line just above it is total union membership, again, tracking closely with private sector unionization because, again, that's where the labor market in the private sector is so much larger. What you see is a dramatically different story in the public sector, which is a sharp and steep increase beginning in the 60s and 70s, and then really steady, representing about 35% of all state and local workers across the country. And so in some sense, these changes in historical trajectory should sort of change our conception of what a union member looks like. In my case, I think about in some sense, a steel worker, a guy with a hard hat and steel-toed boots whose terminal educational achievement was probably a high school degree. Today, if you want to think about the archetype of a union member, it's probably a female middle school teacher in her 40s with a master's degree. So it's a much different kind of mode of organized labor. So this also shows a second big difference. Not only is the historical trajectory between these two types of unionism different, but the sources of law that govern them are also different, which is to say private sector unions are governed by federal law, the Wagner Act of 1935, as subsequently modified by Congress, but public employee unions are governed by state laws supplemented by local ordinances. And you can see that there's then vast differences in the percentage of public employees that belong to unions across the states, with our home state here of New York at the top of the heap, where about 70% of all state and local employees are members of or parts of collective bargaining unions. So there's lots of differences here across the sources of law. And then I think a big difference here is, a third difference is that public employee unions, and this goes to my case that we need to think about them as different, is that they may be called unions, and that is they're in the same genus, or excuse me, they may be of the same genus as private sector unions, but they're really a different species. And that goes to the way collective bargaining is structured in the public sector. So in the public sector, we have a phenomenon of what I call 2 bites at the apple. That is, public employee unions can try to win things directly for their members at the bargaining table through collective bargaining, or that failing, they can also try to win things directly through politics, that is to say, through electioneering and lobbying. And that's something that private sector unions can't do. They can really only win things for their members directly at the bargaining table. And this leads to a fourth difference, which is that public employee unions, in some sense, because of that ability to engage in politics through electioneering and lobbying, can put themselves a little bit on both sides of the bargaining table in a way that private sector unions can't imagine. And then a fifth and final difference is that there's a lack of market forces at work in the collective bargaining structure of state and local government. So if you're Boeing in Seattle and you're not getting the deal you want from the machinists union, you can at least threaten to move to South Carolina. If those of you are not getting the deal you want in your cities or villages, you can't threaten to pick up and move somewhere else. The village is where it is. It's rooted in a place. That, along with a whole host of other factors, mean that the market forces aren't there. So collective bargaining in the public sector becomes much more like collective bargaining in a monopoly industry than collective bargaining in the private sector. So in that sense, what we see is some big differences. That's really the first big point I wanted to share. So the second point is, how powerful are public employee unions in our politics at the state and local government? And I think at the state and local level, there's some of the most powerful interest groups, and I try to lay out a case for this and provide lots of data in the book. And I give them, so at least at the theoretical level, they've got a few advantages over other interest groups that try to get their way in state and local government. First, they have more access to politicians through the legally required collective bargaining process. They can more easily mobilize their members for protests and so on because they are the government's own employees. It's the political activity of government's own employees, so they're there on the steps of City Hall or the state capitol. They have a reliable revenue stream through dues checkoff and agency shop mechanisms. They don't have to go out and raise money the way, say, environmental groups or gun rights groups have to do. And they have, at least until 2009, operated in a very low visibility policy environment. Journalists didn't pay much attention to public sector collective bargaining. The public didn't really know much about it to the extent that they did. Collective bargaining, those are nice words that sounded like everything was good. So they're also very big spenders on elections. This is data for federal campaigns in hard money contributions. But just to give you a sense, I have a lot more data at the state level in the book. But what you can see is in hard money donations to candidates for federal office over the last 25 years, in the top 15 in bold, are almost half of them are unions who are either exclusively public employee unions or their membership is about half, say like SEIU. If you put, for example, so again, these are groups with a lot of influence and access at the federal level. If you put the teachers' unions together, for example, it probably makes sense analytically to do that. They're really blowing away the competition in hard money donations to candidates. So again, that's that political influence and ability to exercise AFSCME still right there at the top as well. So what you have is a set of political influence. I'll give you a couple of examples from the state level, just from California for a state assembly candidates. Again, hard money donations in the last election cycle. You can see public employee unions are right there at the top, and they're often allies with private sector unions, and they're really outspending the next three groups combined. Here in New York State, for example, the teachers' unions alone in the first decade of the 21st century outspent all business associations combined in hard and soft money 5-to-1 in the first decade. So again, all I'm trying to establish here is these are powerful, important political players at the state and local level. So what then are some of the effects of public employee unionization and public employee power? What's been the effects of the Taylor Law here, say in New York State, which is the governing statute? Well, the first is, I think the consequences here is by creating these powerful interest groups, it's tended to drive up the costs of government. First and foremost, in terms of salary. I'll give you an example. If you have municipal fire departments that are unionized, pay on average about 9 to 10% more in salary. And they also tend to spend about 25% more in benefits than municipalities where fire departments are not unionized. So the effect is, not surprisingly, the whole point of allowing sets of workers to unionize is to capture more resources, and usually that comes more in the form of pay. The issue here is that also on the benefit side, so you drive up costs. The second big effect is to, in a sense, drive up costs in terms of pensions and public employee health care. And this leads to a phenomenon that I document or call crowding out, which means basically as these costs grow, and I'm sure many of you have experienced with this, as a slice of your budget, if you're paying more into pension funds or into public employee health care, there's less money left over for other things, other innovations, other priorities, other things you'd like to do, filling potholes, investing in infrastructure, right? So this phenomenon of crowding out is one thing that sort of ties the hands or constricts state and local government in what it might be able to do to provide to services to especially the middle class and the poor. So I'll just give you an example of this phenomenon from my home city of New York City. If you take under Mayor Bloomberg, benefit costs, pension and health, from the time he first entered office in 2002 as a slice of the $88 billion New York City budget, and to 2014, that slice of public employee fringe benefits went from 15% to 34% of the city's budget. So obviously that's put a huge squeeze on what New York City could do short of raising taxes or cutting other programs. New York currently has fewer police officers and fewer firefighters than it did at the outset of the Bloomberg administration. And that's, you could argue, an effect of this crowding out phenomenon. Third big factor that I, again, try to provide a lot of data to support in my book is a decline or reduction in government productivity or efficiency. So obviously this teacher's contract I took a picture of was written by lawyers. It's extremely detailed. If you just took the, say, top inch, that covers salary, benefits, maybe the first 15 pages. All of the rest of the contract is work rules. Work rules that, in a sense, are meant to shield employees from management and to constrict management's rights, right? Such that, in some sense, we end up paying managers to do things, even though we're still paying principals, still paying prison wardens, but they're not able to carry out those tasks. Innovations that innovative government managers might come up with are squelched even before they get out the door. They're dead on arrival because they would run against the work rules already negotiated in contracts. So that reduces government efficiency, and in that sense can sort of skew the priorities of what people can do. And in that sense, I think I'll just try to kind of conclude on this is, so I think that it's a sort of negative case and not so optimistic about the benefits of public employee unions, but let me say one thing to their credit, which is that they have won more things for their members. That is, they've done very well by teachers, by police officers, by firefighters, right? But that's really part of this larger story of the transformation of the American labor movement that I mentioned, which is, and I'll give you one bit of numbers, which is from 1971 to 2005, the percentage of unionists in the top third of the income scale increased by 25%. At that same period, the percentage of unionists in the bottom third of the income scale decreased by 45%. So what you're seeing is a labor movement today that no longer really represents, say, the poor or the downtrodden or people with low levels of education and skills, but really is representing more the already relatively affluent, and that's sort of an artifact of this transformation of people being, say, steel workers like my grandfather to public employee professors like his grandson with PhDs. So in that sense, I think what we would see is that this is why this has been such a fundamental issue, is because this drives up costs and drives down service at the same time of constricting the hands of innovative politicians, mayors, and executives, and governors throughout the country. Thank you very much.